The blade kisses old tape, and the room exhales a breath held for decades. Dust lifts like ash from a forgotten fire, swirling in the narrow beam of a single work light that cuts through the gloom like a detective's flashlight in a noir film. The first lid pops open with a sharp crack, echoing off the concrete walls of this underground archive, a vault where secrets were buried deeper than bones. Stenciled codes: AEC for Atomic Energy Commission, DoD for Department of Defense, stare back at us in blocky black letters, the faded signatures of a secrecy that spanned generations. Our camera glides slowly over the cardboard walls, scarred by years of neglect and intentional silence, then settles on a handwritten note tucked into the corner. Return to records, restricted. It never returned, left to gather dust like the truths it guarded. Ellen Carson, the archivist who has dedicated half her career to chasing these misfiled truths, slips on her white cotton gloves with the reverence of a surgeon preparing for an operation. Her hands tremble slightly, not from fear, but from the anticipation of uncovering what was meant to stay hidden. She slides a stack free from its cardboard tomb, narrating in a hush that blends respect with a subtle warning, as if the papers themselves might bite back. Ledger cards yellowed with age. Routing slips dotted with cryptic notations. A carbon copy that still holds the faint ghost of graphite fingerprints, imprints from hands that typed orders without questioning their weight. She follows an internal logic of file numbers and cross-references, her fingers dancing across the pages like a pianist recalling a long-forgotten melody, until her hand pauses over a manila folder with 3 words stamped in sober blue ink: human factor. The spine creaks open like the door to a forbidden room, releasing a faint musty scent that speaks of locked-away years. Inside, directives that read like macabre recipes, materials listed in precise quantities, methods outlined in step-by-step detachment, measurements calibrated to the last decimal. An index tethers doctors from prestigious universities, military units with classified designations, and shadowy labs into one clean, interconnected diagram, a web of complicity that spans coasts and agencies. The prose is sterile, almost deceptively kind. Words like optimize performance, observe reactions, minimize externalities that mask the human cost. But in the margins, dark pencil scratches cut deeper, revealing the raw underbelly: contain local press leaks at all costs, no family notification under any circumstances, subjects unaware, routine medical checks only. Under the small talk of bureaucracy, something larger presses its face against the glass, a monstrous outline of ethical voids and calculated indifference. He notices it first. Tom Alvarez, a former infantry soldier with the weathered lines of a man who's carried invisible burdens, stands just off the table's edge, letting the papers find him rather than reaching out. He has the stance of someone who's waited a lifetime to be told the full truth. His posture straight, but his eyes shadowed by memories of orders followed blindly. Tom doesn't touch the pages at first. He reads the typography, the cadence of commands he once lived inside, commands that turned men into pawns. "I've seen this phrasing before," he says, his voice gravelly with recognition as he taps a paragraph about exposure protocols. He remembers the feeling of being briefed without being truly informed, how authority can make ignorance sound like patriotic duty, how briefings in dusty tents promise safety while delivering danger. We stack the memos in chronological order, reconstructing the intention piece by piece, like archaeologists piecing together a shattered artifact. Human factor, the documents explain in dry terms, is not an ethical boundary to be respected but a variable to be manipulated. Tolerance levels charted on graphs, recovery times logged in tables, thresholds of failure pushed to their limits. Cross-agency correspondence routes through overlapping committees, each signature cascading to the next like a chain reaction in a nuclear core. Grants flow from energy offices to medical schools to defense contractors, funneled through shell accounts to obscure the trail. Procurement codes repeat like a relentless drumbeat. The same vendors supplying mysterious compounds, the same couriers delivering sealed shipments under cover of night, the same packages arriving at different doors but always with the same aura of finality. Redactions march across the pages in confident black ink, thick bars hiding names and specifics, yet enough escapes through the cracks to sketch a horrifying shape. references to pediatric wards in state facilities, correctional research units with high turnover, field observation battalions in remote zones. Ellen points to a reference list that shouldn't exist in any humane world. A set of collection points, arranged by accessibility and oversight. Places where people had little voice, fewer choices, and no escape. On a loose routing slip, someone has underlined a phrase twice with urgent strokes. Low-resistance populations. A term that chills the blood, implying not just vulnerability but deliberate selection of the powerless. The room deepens around us, shadows lengthening as if the archive itself is listening. Box lids become rooftops over hidden worlds. File numbers transform into street addresses etched in code, and our light picks out the edges of an infrastructure designed to be invisible. A network of shadows woven into the fabric of society. On a bottom shelf, metal film canisters whisper with their own magnetic gravity. Fragments of tests that needed a lens more than a conscience. Reels capturing moments where ethics were sacrificed for data. Tom watches us thread paper through time, his jaw tight, eyes locked on a paragraph that treats flesh like raw material and pain like mere background noise, quantifiable and dismissible. We ask a question that feels too simple, too late, hanging in the air like smoke. What happens when state interest becomes a mask for unchecked ambition? The answers, scattered across these pages, are equations that never mention a single name, reducing lives to variables. Every euphemism, cohort, volunteer, subject, erases a face, blots out a story. We choose to reverse the math to humanize the data. We will follow the signatures back to the rooms where consent was presumed and risk was exported, tracing the ink to the hands that held the pens, uncovering the faces behind the faceless bureaucracy. On the final page of the Human Factor folder, a map grid appears, coordinates assigned to institutional environments with clinical detachment. One column is coded nutritional augmentation, juveniles. A bland phrase that lands like a dull blade against the throat, hiding experiments on children's growing bodies. Another note, clipped to the corner with a rusty staple, lists suppliers for fortified compounds, and a courier route that snakes past brick buildings that once called themselves schools but functioned as labs. Ellen closes the folder slowly, her gloved fingers lingering, and looks up as if asking permission from the ghosts in the room. We don't need it. The truth demands we proceed. Tomorrow, we leave the sterile confines of the archive for those addresses. Places where breakfasts were measured not for nourishment but for metrics, where childhood was catalogued by lot number and vial, where innocence was quantified and discarded. The paper trail points us to buildings that promised care and delivered control, facades of benevolence hiding chambers of calculation. The boxes have told us where to go next. The children who lived there, now adults scarred by unseen forces, will tell us what it truly cost, their voices adding flesh to the bones of these documents. The gates creak open on a building that still calls itself a school, though time has stripped the paint to reveal rust like old bloodstains, and weeds choke the cracked pavement like fingers reaching from the grave. Windows are boarded up with plywood warped by rain. Halls echo hollow with the ghosts of laughter long silenced, but the memories here never left. They linger in the air like a persistent chill. Inside, we find dormitories lined with narrow beds, their metal frames still bearing the dents of restless nights. Rows of desks facing chalkboards that once bore the pretense of learning but served as backdrops for deception. This is where the state kept its children, orphans plucked from broken homes, wards abandoned by society, and those deemed unfit for families of their own, labels that justified their isolation. And this is where experiments wore the mask of nutrition, turning sustenance into science. Former residents return with us, now elderly figures with faces etched by time and unspoken trauma, their voices trembling as they walk the halls, each step stirring dust that carries the scent of institutional bleach and forgotten meals. They remember morning porridge with a strange tang, metallic like swallowing pennies, bitter like regret, different from anything natural. We thought it was vitamins to make us stronger. One recalls, her eyes distant as she stares at a faded mural on the wall. But afterward, they'd take our blood. Always the blood, drawn with cold needles that left bruises like badges. The memory of rolled sleeves and tight straps is sharper than the taste itself. evoking the prick of fear mingled with the sting of betrayal. They speak of nurses' offices with locked cabinets gleaming under fluorescent lights, of lead-sealed containers discreetly tucked away in drawers labeled medical supplies, of whispers among staff when shipments arrived in unmarked vans at dawn. We lay the documents from the archive across a table that once served lunches, now scarred with knife marks from bored children, spreading them out like evidence in a courtroom. Typed grant applications describe fortified meals for cognitive enhancement, promising brighter futures through science, but in the margins, scrawled notes betray another purpose. Radioactive tracers mixed into the oats to track absorption, mineral studies using isotopes that glowed invisibly in the dark, the charting of long-term exposure effects on developing organs. University consortiums signed off on budgets with flourish, their ornate seals pressed alongside federal energy offices, turning academia into an accomplice. It reads like scientific progress on paper, a noble quest for knowledge. In practice, it was hunger manipulated into compliance, meals laced with secrets that altered bodies from the inside out. Photographs emerge from personal albums, yellowed snapshots pulled from wallets. Children lined up with spoons in hand, smiling under the gaze of a camera they never questioned, their grins forced by authority figures promising treats. The innocence of those images fractures under testimony, shattering like glass underfoot. One man describes nosebleeds that followed the special breakfasts, blood dripping onto trays like accusations. Another recalls friends who grew frail, coughing through endless nights without explanation, their small bodies wasting away under the guise of care. These recollections, scattered yet overlapping like puzzle pieces, are shards of the same experiment. An experiment that saw young bodies as pliable vessels for data, canvases for testing limits without regard for the permanent marks left behind. Tom Alvarez listens closely, a soldier among civilians, piecing their words into a larger pattern that spans his own experiences. He recognizes the tone of necessary sacrifice, the same one once spoken to him in fatigues during briefings that promised glory but delivered peril. Here, however, the uniforms were white coats instead of camouflage, and the battlefield was a cafeteria lined with linoleum floors sticky from spilled milk. The continuity chills him to the core. Orders disguised as care, danger disguised as progress, all under the umbrella of authority. He looks at the papers again, his finger tapping the recurring stamp, human factor, with a rhythm that echoes his heartbeat, the language the same across eras, the targets simply younger, more fragile. We find, in one letter between administrators buried in a subfolder, a telling phrase that drips with cynicism. Subjects are unlikely to question irregularities due to age and dependency. The state had found the perfect population, small, voiceless, and hidden behind closed institutional doors that muffled cries and questions alike. For the children, the experiments were daily routine, blended seamlessly into schedules of classes and chores. For the scientists, they were clean data points, plotted on graphs in distant offices. For history, they were erased until now, buried under layers of denial and destruction of records. Standing in the empty dining hall, where echoes bounce off peeling walls and broken glass crunches under our boots, we ask, how many of these children carried the invisible weight of those tests into adulthood, never knowing the source of their chronic illnesses, their unexplained pains? How many graves hold stories never told, unmarked plots where young lives ended prematurely? The records are incomplete by design, pages torn out or inked over, but the survivors' memories stitch the outline of something deliberate, something coordinated on a scale that defies comprehension. As the camera lingers on the peeling walls, capturing flakes of paint drifting like snow in a forsaken winter, and broken glass reflecting fractured light, we place pins on our growing map. The orphanages are no longer isolated stories whispered in the dark. They are coordinates on a pattern of exploitation, dots connecting to form a sinister constellation. And the documents hint at a next destination. Facilities where the subjects weren't children but men behind bars, trading what little freedom they had for promises they didn't understand, illusions of choice in a world of chains. The trail leads us from classrooms echoing with lost lessons to cell blocks resounding with clanging metal, where the same equation of power and silence was written into flesh, etched deeper with every passing day. The clang of steel doors replaces the echoes of classrooms, a harsh symphony of locks turning and hinges groaning under the weight of confinement. Concrete walls rise close, painted in layers of gray that never quite cover the stains beneath. Blood, sweat, perhaps tears dried into permanence. This is where the state stored not only its prisoners, but also its experiments, turning penitentiaries into dual-purpose facilities. Cages for the convicted and labs for the curious. In the 1950s and 60s, these institutions across the country doubled as laboratories, testing grounds where desperation became currency and hope was bartered for harm. We sit across from Alan, a former inmate whose face still carries the hardness of time served, lines carved by years of vigilance and regret. He lifts his sleeves slowly, revealing scars, patches of rough skin etched like maps of forgotten territories, raised and discolored from chemicals that seared deeper than fire. He recalls being approached by guards with forms to sign, pages dense with jargon that swam before his eyes like a foreign language. Consent, he laughs bitterly, the sound echoing off the interview room's bare walls. But they never told us what we were agreeing to, just that it was harmless, just that it was for science, and we'd get cigarettes or a few dollars shaved off our sentence. The exchange was simple. They offered smokes, he offered skin, unaware that toxic compounds, industrial solvents, experimental herbicides, even precursors to chemical weapons, were being painted directly onto his body, absorbed like poison through pores. Archived reports confirm his memory with chilling accuracy, protocols detailing the dermal absorption of chemicals. Substances later linked to severe burns that blistered like acid, carcinogenic effects that bloomed years later as tumors, and neurological damage that left hands trembling and minds fogged. The language of the reports is clinical, detached, application area defined by grid, reaction time monitored in minutes, systemic spread tracked via blood draws. But the human voice behind those sterile lines is Alan's. A young man in a cell, scratching at burning flesh with no relief, told it was normal irritation, while guards watched impassively from the other side of the bars. The paper trail doesn't stop with prison authorities. It branches out like veins. Margins show initials from pharmaceutical companies hungry for data, contractors linked to military research with ties to wartime innovations, even university labs testing formulas intended for warfare and industry, all intertwined in a web of profit and progress. Boxes of ointments, sprays, and powders arrived through the same supply chains that fed other state-run studies, delivered in crates labeled hygiene supplies to avoid scrutiny. The continuity is unmistakable. The same stamps from the AEC, the same couriers with nondescript vans, the same officials signing off with flourish. Human bodies were reduced to test sites, categorized and compared in silence, their reactions noted like weather patterns. Walking the corridors now, the air feels heavy, as though the walls themselves remember the moans and cries that once filled them, absorbing the suffering like sponges. Former inmates we interviewed describe hallways lined with men waiting for their turn, their arms bandaged with gauze that turned yellow from pus, their eyes glazed from compounds applied without warning of their true purpose. Some hallucinogens that twisted reality, others corrosives that ate away at dignity. The prison, meant to contain crime, became a warehouse of data. Rows of living subjects cataloged for convenience, their cells transformed into observation chambers with peepholes for scientists. Tom Alvarez walks these halls with us, running his hand along cold bars that still hum with the vibration of slammed doors. He notes how similar the logic feels, vulnerable populations used as variables in a grand equation. First children who couldn't refuse, their youth a shield against inquiry. Now prisoners whose refusal carried punishment, extra time added like interest on a debt. Different demographics, same designation, low resistance. A term that now echoes like a curse. Each time, the documents return to the same refrain. The human factor, a code for expendability. But inside the stacks of reports is a transition point. References not to confined populations, but to open fields, to soldiers in formation under the desert sun, where the sky itself became a canvas for destruction. Directives describe field trials and observed responses under extreme conditions, shifting from enclosed spaces to vast expanses. The setting shifts, the subjects change, from the incarcerated to the enlisted, But the rationale does not, a thread of exploitation pulling tighter. From orphans to inmates, the next step was the military itself. Men trained to obey, positioned at the edge of atomic fire, their loyalty weaponized against them. The trail leads us out of the prison gates and into the Nevada desert, where soldiers once stood against a light brighter than the sun, a brilliance that seared retinas and souls alike. What began in locked rooms and sealed wards now unfolds beneath a mushroom cloud, with cameras rolling and orders unquestioned, the scale escalating from individual torment to collective trial. The human factor moves from hidden corridors to the battlefield, testing not just flesh but survival itself, pushing the boundaries of what a body and a nation could endure. The desert stretches endless, silent, almost holy in its emptiness, until you remember what once tore across the sky, ripping the fabric of reality with a force born of man's hubris. Out here, in Nevada's barren flats dotted with scrub brush and ancient rocks, soldiers were marched into place beneath a sun that wasn't the sun at all, but a man-made inferno. Operation Desert Rock. The name sounds benign, even mundane, like a geological survey or a training exercise. But the reality, captured in flickering reels of declassified film now digitized for our scrutiny, is anything but grainy images of horror dressed as duty. We roll the grainy footage on a portable projector, the black and white images dancing across a makeshift screen in the windswept sands. Lines of young men, helmets strapped tight against skulls, uniforms pressed to regulation sharpness, stand with their backs to the horizon, rifles at their sides like talismans against the unknown. A countdown blares over tinny speakers, numbers ticking toward a brightness no human should ever face, each digit a step closer to oblivion. At 0, the earth erupts in fury. A sphere of light devours the desert, the air itself folding, burning, roaring like a beast unleashed. Shadows snap against the ground, elongated and grotesque. The camera lingers as the mushroom cloud climbs skyward, a towering pillar of doom, and soldiers are ordered forward, toward the dust that chokes lungs, into the heat that blisters skin, through the invisible fallout that invades every cell. Tom Alvarez takes us through it slowly, his voice tight with the strain of reliving hell, pausing to point at details in the footage that others might miss. The subtle flinch in a soldier's stance, the way dust clings to sweat-soaked brows. He remembers the orders. No looking back, no breaking formation, no questions that might reveal doubt. They said it was training for the future of warfare, he recalls, his eyes fixed on the horizon where ghosts still linger. But training for what? We weren't firing weapons. We were the weapons, our bodies the proving ground. He describes the shockwave knocking men down like dominoes, the taste of dust metallic on his tongue like blood from a bitten lip, the way skin prickled as if stung by a swarm of invisible bees, followed by nausea that twisted guts for days. The files corroborate his memory with merciless detail, briefings describing troop orientation to nuclear combat conditions in bland terms. But between the lines, something else emerges. Data tables charting radiation exposure in REMs, projected onset of symptoms like acute radiation syndrome, recovery metrics plotted with actuarial precision. The phrasing is mechanical: observation window for acute effects, tolerance index for long-term viability. Soldiers weren't simply trained. They were measured, their every reaction, from vomiting in the trenches to hair loss weeks later, becoming an entry in a study disguised as exercise, a charade of preparedness. The orders reveal an unsettling consistency. Exposure protocols, drafted with the same terminology found in orphanage and prison files, echoing across the documents like a recurring nightmare. Minimize external awareness. Maximize controlled observation. Phrases that prioritized secrecy over safety. The human factor, once a hidden footnote in margins, now appears in bold headers, elevated to doctrine. The experiment has grown, no longer confined to cells or cafeterias, but expanded to regiments of young men sworn to obedience, their oaths binding them to silence even as their bodies rebelled. Film canisters retrieved from AEC archives show officers taking notes as soldiers advance toward Ground Zero, cameras rolling from reinforced towers, as if this were theater staged for science, complete with scripts and rehearsals. One chilling annotation in the margins of a memo reads, "Morale intact, favorable variable for sustained operations, reducing fear to a checkbox. It wasn't resilience being tested. It was endurance. How much radiation could seep into bones? How much fear could be swallowed before morale cracked? How much destruction a body and a spirit could carry before breaking under the weight? Tom walks the test site with us, the desert now quiet but still scarred with craters like lunar wounds. His boots crunching on vitrified sand turned to glass by atomic heat. His voice falters as he recalls comrades who fell sick years later, their cancers written off as coincidence by VA doctors, their suffering buried under classification stamps that sealed files tighter than coffins. He pauses, staring into the horizon where the flash once bloomed, a phantom light still burning in his mind's eye. "We weren't trained," he whispers, the wind carrying his words away. "We were exposed, sacrificed on the altar of curiosity disguised as security." From here, the story broadens like the desert itself. As we pin the desert site to our growing map, the pattern sharpens. Orphanages with their echoing halls, prisons with their clanging bars, now military grounds baked under relentless sun. All chosen because resistance was impossible, power imbalances baked into the selection. The logic is unmistakable. Select populations without a voice, without power, and measure their breaking point, extracting data like or from unwilling Earth. But the next files push the pattern further, beyond isolated incidents. They don't just point to individual sites scattered like accidents. They outline a network, a lattice of institutions across the country bound by the same directives and language, threads woven by central planners. The evidence suggests coordination, an organized system built not on chance, but on design, with oversight committees meeting in smoke-filled rooms to align agendas. Our map begins to look less like scattered dots and more like a blueprint, a schematic of systemic abuse, leading us to the next discovery. A national plan hidden in plain sight, a framework that turned vulnerability into a national asset. On the wall of our editing suite, pins and strings begin to form a shape under the flickering light of monitors humming with digitized footage. Each point, an orphanage in Massachusetts with its red brick facade hiding sterile wards, a prison in Pennsylvania ringed by razor wire, a test site in Nevada scarred by blasts, glows under the dim light of the projector, casting long shadows that dance like conspirators. At first, they appear scattered, accidents of geography dictated by convenience. But as more documents surface from dusty shelves and FOIA requests, the lines between them tighten, connecting institutions separated by hundreds of miles with unbreakable threads of shared purpose. The randomness dissolves like mist under sunlight. What emerges is a map not of chance, but of intention, a deliberate grid engineered for efficiency. We sift through protocols from different states, each stamped with unique letterheads from local agencies yet echoing the same language as if copied from a master template. Subject containment procedures standardized. Nutritional augmentation protocols synchronized. Field exposure guidelines unified. The phrases repeat like scripture across decades, across agencies, a liturgy of exploitation recited in boardrooms and labs. In Wisconsin, a ward describes fortified oatmeal that left a chalky residue on lips. In Maryland, a prisoner remembers ointments that burned his skin like liquid fire, leaving scars that itched in humid weather. In Nevada, soldiers recall orders to march toward the cloud, their boots sinking into irradiated sand. Each story different in detail, yet the instructions identical, down to the phrasing of consent forms that promised nothing and took everything. Someone had written a manual, a classified playbook, and many had followed it, passing it down like a sacred text. The files show more than repetition. They reveal a philosophy etched into every page. Minimization of public disruption, alongside maximization of scientific yield. A calculus where human cost was a footnote. The balance wasn't moral, it was mathematical, an equation of silence versus knowledge, where ethics were variables to be adjusted. Each program justified itself not by necessity, but by opportunity, exploiting gaps in oversight like cracks in a dam. Where oversight was weakest, in remote facilities or underfunded institutions, the experiments flourished, blooming like toxic flowers. Where voices were smallest, muffled by youth or incarceration, the data collection was greatest. Vulnerability wasn't a risk to be mitigated. It was the method, the core ingredient in a recipe for unchecked advancement. As Ellen Carson flips through pages of procurement logs, her eyes widening behind her glasses, a pattern of contractors emerges like a constellation in the night sky. The same couriers delivered shipments to orphanages and prisons, their vans rumbling down back roads at odd hours. The same laboratories analyzed blood samples from soldiers and children alike, vials labeled with codes that hid origins. Universities played middlemen, their grant reports word-for-word replicas. Only the subjects changed, from juvenile cohorts to incarcerated volunteers, while budgets swelled with federal dollars. The system wasn't fragmented. It was interlocked, designed to look decentralized while drawing strength from its repetition, a machine oiled by complicity. Tom Alvarez studies the growing map, his finger tracing lines from city to desert to coast with the precision of a strategist plotting a campaign. "It wasn't about us as individuals," he says quietly, his voice laced with a dawning fury. "It was about access. We were where they could get away with it, chosen for our silence." His words carry the weight of realization that none of this was random, that each of them was selected because they had no power to refuse, no platform to protest. The human factor wasn't resilience or bravery. It was vulnerability weaponized, turned into a tool for those in power. Our camera lingers on the map as the lines form something chilling. A lattice of compliance, a national skeleton hidden beneath the skin of democracy. Not a single rogue experiment gone awry, but a doctrine carried out under shifting names and shifting faces, evolving with each administration but never truly ending. It is here, in the overlap of stamps and signatures that repeat like signatures on a death warrant, that the hypothesis solidifies. Behind every project was a unifying logic of exploitation, a blueprint for using the powerless to fuel progress. And then, buried in a folder marked Special Substances Division, tucked away in a supplementary annex like an afterthought, we find the next layer, a escalation that twists the knife deeper. Memoranda describing controlled administration of psychochemicals and non-lethal agents to enlisted volunteers, complete with dosage charts and behavioral notations that read like scripts for psychological horror. Doses calibrated to induce madness, endpoints defined by collapse, notations on how subjects begged for relief. The map expands once more, pointing not to orphanages or prisons, but to military camps where men were given something in their veins instead of on their skin, invading minds as well as bodies. The transition is clear, a logical progression in the mad science of it all. From food laced with tracers to dermal exposure that scarred flesh, from radiation that poisoned from afar to chemicals that assaulted from within, the progression moves deeper into the body, closer to the mind, probing the psyche itself. If children and prisoners were used to measure endurance of the physical form, then soldiers became instruments for testing control itself, their wills bent and broken under the influence of substances designed to shatter reality. The next chapter of the story lies not in deserts or dining halls, but in compounds where the battlefield was the human nervous system, a war waged in synapses and shadows. The files marked Special Substances Division unfold with the cold precision of a pharmacology manual, each page a ledger of experiments. Dates stamped in red ink, doses measured in milligrams of malice, delivery methods ranging from injections in sterile tents to pills handed out like rations. To the casual reader, it looks like routine medical research, a pursuit of better treatments. But when read aloud against the voices of veterans, the meaning becomes unmistakable, a symphony of suffering. These weren't trials in the safety of labs with willing participants. They were conducted on soldiers in uniform, men told they were part of readiness evaluations essential to national defense, their doubts dismissed as disloyalty. Tom Alvarez walks us through the terminology with the eye of someone who once lived under it, his finger underlining words that still haunt his dreams. Endpoints. The papers say, hallucinations that twisted comrades into monsters, disorientation that left men wandering bases like lost souls, neurological collapse that ended in convulsions on dirt floors. Controls. Meaning sober comrades ordered to observe and report, their friendships strained by the role of watcher. Memos circulate between army medics with clipboards, intelligence officers in crisp shirts, and contracted chemists from private firms, their tones stripped of humanity. Subject 11 displayed rapid onset tremors at 14 minutes, vocalizing distress calls. Subject 12. Respiratory depression at 22. Requiring intervention. The words feel like statistics until you picture young men collapsing on cots, eyes wide with terror, their bodies reduced to data while their minds fractured. Former participants, some willing to speak now after years of nightmares, recall being given injections or tablets with no explanation beyond routine trials for peak performance. One describes the room spinning like a carousel from hell, his squad leader watching with a clipboard, recording his descent into confusion as colors bled and voices echoed from nowhere. Another recalls being strapped down after violent seizures that racked his frame, only to be woken hours later by orderlies who insisted nothing unusual had happened, gaslighting him into doubting his own sanity. They were told not to talk, not even among themselves, threats of court-martial hanging like swords. Silence was as much a part of the protocol as the drugs, woven into the fabric of obedience. Shipping manifests connect these experiments directly back to the same laboratories that supplied orphanage compounds and prison ointments, the paper trail a chain linking horrors. The continuity is staggering. Identical vendor codes for hallucinogens derived from LSD derivatives or nerve agents. Identical chain of custody forms signed with the same hurried scrawls, stamped this time with military insignia that lent an air of legitimacy. Where the orphans were listed as juveniles in neat columns and prisoners as inmates with ID numbers, the soldiers appear in tables as volunteers, a word that mocks the reality. Yet their testimonies make one thing clear: volunteering was never an option. It was command enforced by rank and the fear of repercussions. The detachment of the language is striking, a veil of professionalism over atrocity. Reports describe terror as adverse effective response, quantified on scales from mild to severe. Breakdown is acute endpoint, marked with timestamps. Recovery, if it happened at all, is return to baseline functionality, ignoring the lingering flashbacks and shattered nerves. The indifference bleeds through every line, a callousness that treats minds as machines to be tinkered with. Tom reflects on what it meant to be considered expendable in the service of knowledge, his gaze distant as he recounts nights of sweat-soaked sheets. "We thought we were training for war against enemies abroad," he says quietly, "but they were waging one inside us, turning our thoughts against ourselves." He compares the experience to the nuclear exercises, different methods, same intent, to push bodies and now minds beyond safety until they revealed the breaking point, data harvested like crops from unwilling fields. The files don't stop at individual dosing in isolated barracks. They reference broader field dispersal simulations, hinting at something even larger, a scale that dwarfs previous horrors. Notes describe aerosolized agents, released from planes or vehicles, paired with diagrams of airflow patterns and city street grids overlaid with wind roses. The scope widens again, from testing individuals in controlled chaos to testing entire communities without their knowledge, turning everyday life into an unwitting arena. And so the pattern advances, a virus spreading unchecked. What began in orphanages with tainted meals, spread to prisons with scarring salves, escalated with soldiers under chemical siege, now threatens to spill into neighborhoods, streets, whole cities where civilians breathe the air of experimentation. The logic of the human factor expands to its most chilling question. What happens when the laboratory is not a room, or a prison wing, or a desert, but an entire community breathing the same air, oblivious to the invisible assault? The sound of waves crashing against rocky shores and gulls crying overhead masks what the documents call environmental dispersal trials, a euphemism for airborne invasions. Along America's coastlines in the 1950s and 60s, the military tested how far invisible clouds could travel. Using cities themselves as unwitting laboratories, urban sprawls turned into vast petri dishes. Reports describe aerosol releases and obscuration events, words that could mean dusting for crops in rural fields or fog for festive parades, innocuous on the surface. But the blueprints reveal truck-mounted sprayers rumbling through back alleys and naval vessels venting unseen plumes into the air from offshore, dispersing agents like zinc cadmium sulfide or bacterial simulants that mimicked bioweapons. We overlay declassified airflow charts onto maps of San Francisco's foggy hills, Norfolk's bustling ports, and coastal Florida's sunny suburbs, the digital layers aligning with eerie precision. The alignment is chilling. Arrows track wind patterns across entire neighborhoods, lines that cut directly over schools filled with children's laughter, hospitals teeming with the vulnerable, and residential blocks where families slept unaware. A note in one memo reads, "Urban density provides optimal observation conditions for particle drift, treating population as an asset for measurement, not protection." Eyewitnesses, ordinary citizens now in their twilight years, recall strange mornings decades later. A sudden fog that smelled metallic like ozone after a storm, unusual mists rolling in from the docks that left a gritty residue on windowsills. Many remember, too, sudden clusters of coughs that rattled chests, fevers that burned hot without cause, and hospital wards filled with respiratory cases that overwhelmed nurses. Most dismissed it at the time as seasonal illness or pollution from factories, never suspecting the sky itself was complicit. Only now, with the documents in hand, do the memories align with deliberate releases, puzzle pieces snapping into place. The testimony of sailors adds another layer, their sea-weathered faces creased with regret. A former deckhand describes being ordered to test dispersal equipment just offshore, watching white clouds trail behind their ship like exhaust from a phantom engine. He recalls asking what the substance was. His curiosity met with a stern gaze. The officer's reply was simple, "Don't ask. It's safe, and it's for the greater good." Safety, as always, was assumed, not proven. A lie that echoed across decks slick with salt spray. On camera, epidemiologists help us decode the consequences, their voices measured but urgent as they point to spikes on graphs. Patterns of infections surging like waves, rare clusters of illnesses that baffled contemporaries, even anomalies in local cancer rates, all tracing back to the same years as the so-called urban dispersals. Correlations too strong to ignore. The reports reduce it to data points and timelines, sterile entries and logs, but behind every line lies a family shattered, a street in mourning, a city unknowingly transformed into a laboratory where the air carried secrets. Tom Alvarez listens to the accounts, his jaw set like a vice, fists clenched at his sides. "They stopped asking if we could endure," he says, his tone laced with controlled rage. "They started asking how many of us could endure without ever knowing why, turning ignorance into a weapon." The shift is clear, from individuals forced into experiments with at least a facade of consent to entire communities tested en masse, their daily lives the control group. Vulnerability now meant not just lack of choice but simple proximity, living in the wrong place at the wrong time, breathing the wrong air. The memos justify the projects with the same refrain: national security imperatives, preparedness for asymmetrical threats, minimal public disruption to maintain morale. In reality, it was convenience disguised as defense, a shortcut through ethics. Populations weren't protected. They were measured, their reactions logged from afar by observers in unmarked cars or hidden stations. Cities became silent partners in experiments designed to stay invisible forever, their skylines unwitting backdrops. And yet, the costs could not remain hidden indefinitely. Hospital records unearthed from archives, death certificates yellowed with age, and survivors' voices, quavering but resolute, begin to outline a legacy of harm too wide to dismiss as coincidence, a ripple effect that touched generations. Which raises the next inevitable question. What is the price of those consequences? And who, if anyone, has ever paid it in blood or in dollars? The search for that answer takes us to the next phase of our story, where numbers of the sick collide with numbers on checks, and justice is weighed in the cold currency of compensation, a reckoning that feels as elusive as the agents once dispersed in the wind. Rows of charts and tables fill the screen, their columns stark and unforgiving like ledgers of the damned. Cancers blooming in lungs and bones, leukemia ravaging blood, neurological disorders twisting nerves into knots of pain, autoimmune flare-ups that spiked decades after the so-called tests, leaving bodies at war with themselves. Dr. Ana Reyes, an epidemiologist with a gaze sharp as a scalpel, sits before the data like a witness at trial, her presence commanding. With a steady hand, she traces the curves of graphs rising higher than baseline expectations, each point representing lives altered by exposures they never consented to, invisible assailants that lingered in tissues. These aren't abstractions or statistical anomalies, she says quietly, her voice cutting through the hum of the room. They're fingerprints of what was done, indelible marks on generations. The numbers are not only medical, they are generational, a cascade of suffering passed down like a cursed inheritance. Survivors describe illnesses that appeared not only in themselves but in their children, sometimes their grandchildren, genetic echoes of tampering. Families remember clusters of diagnoses that baffled local doctors, patterns too strange to dismiss. Sudden onsets of rare diseases in neighborhoods downwind from releases, birth defects in areas near test sites. When shown the declassified tables, the shock isn't in the confirmation, but in the knowledge that authorities had tracked these outcomes long before communities even suspected, monitoring from afar like gods indifferent to prayers. Into this grim ledger steps attorney Daniel Marsh, who has spent years representing victims seeking compensation, his office walls lined with boxes of denied claims. He explains the bureaucratic labyrinth survivors faced. Limited eligibility windows that slammed shut like traps, strict definitions of qualified exposure that excluded the indirect victims, and countless exclusions buried in fine print. It was never about justice or righting wrongs, Marsh insists, his tone edged with frustration born of battles lost. It was about minimizing liability, protecting budgets over people. For every payout grudgingly granted, a meager check that couldn't buy back health, dozens were denied, not because they weren't harmed, but because they didn't fit the narrow categories drawn up by policymakers in air-conditioned offices. We uncover internal correspondence between agencies where compensation is discussed less as restitution and more as risk management, memos traded like poker chips. One speaks of acceptable losses within the framework of national advancement, a phrase that equates lives to collateral damage. Another warns against creating precedent for expansive claims that could bankrupt programs. Behind closed doors, victims were reduced to cost projections on spreadsheets, and payouts were timed carefully to coincide with the quiet closing of programs, dispersed just enough to quell scandals without inviting floods. The survivors' stories put human weight behind the paper trail, transforming numbers into narratives of loss. A woman recalls being told her late husband's leukemia was unrelated, despite his presence at multiple test sites, her voice breaking as she clutches a faded photo of him in uniform. A former orphanage resident describes applying for compensation only to be told no records confirmed her participation, because the files had been destroyed decades earlier in routine purges, leaving her with nothing but memories and medical bills. These denials, multiplied across thousands of lives, preserved the image of control while perpetuating silence, a second layer of erasure. Tom Alvarez studies the charts, anger simmering beneath his calm exterior like a storm gathering. They called it acceptable, a calculated risk, he mutters, his eyes flashing. But they never asked us if we accepted it, never bore the cost themselves. His words underscore the bitter truth. The same logic that once justified the experiments, vulnerability as opportunity, also governed the aftermath, a continuum of disregard. Those most powerless in life remained powerless in death, their families left to fight uphill battles for recognition, navigating red tape thicker than prison walls. Dr. Reyes leans over another set of numbers. Dates of compensation payouts aligned with dates programs were shut down amid whispers of exposure. The pattern is undeniable, a choreography of containment. Payments began not when harm was admitted openly, but when exposure risked becoming public through leaks or lawsuits, silence purchased through selective settlements and controlled disclosure, a hush money masquerading as mercy. And so the reckoning never came. Not fully, not fairly, which leads us deeper into the record, to a cache of audio tapes that capture what the memos only hinted at. High-level meetings where officials admitted, in their own voices, that vulnerability itself was a resource to be exploited, a commodity mined without remorse. A truth so stark it could never survive on paper alone. Locked instead in a room without windows, preserved on magnetic tape that now crackles with revelation. The reel clicks into motion, and suddenly we are no longer reading memos. We are hearing them, transported into the past. A cassette recorder whirs softly, its tape carrying the weight of voices never meant for public ears, captured in clandestine sessions. The room captured on that tape was windowless, a sealed conference chamber deep inside a federal building, insulated from the world outside. Here, policy wasn't debated with passion. It was confirmed with clinical efficiency. And in the quiet grain of the recording, officials speak with a calmness that makes the words all the more chilling, their tones laced with the arrogance of unchecked power. One voice lays it bare, cutting through static. Populations with limited recourse provide optimal study conditions, minimizing variables like legal interference. Another answers with agreement, reminding the group that children, inmates, and enlisted personnel could be mobilized with minimal oversight, their lack of agency a boon. No euphemisms here, no sanitized phrasing to soften the edges. The discussion is raw, vulnerability not just a factor but a resource, cataloged by demographics, categorized by risk levels, exploited like oil from the ground. We play the tape for survivors in a quiet room, the audio filling the space like smoke. Alan, the former prisoner, bows his head as the words spill out, his scarred hands gripping the table. "That's exactly how it felt," he whispers, tears welling unbidden. "We weren't people to them. We were access, disposable tools." Across the table, one of the orphanage survivors clenches trembling hands, the past she suspected now confirmed in the dispassionate tones of men in power, her breath catching as names of facilities are mentioned. These aren't accusations anymore. They are confessions, preserved in magnetic tape, undeniable and damning. The signatures on the meeting agenda match those we've seen before: administrators from medical schools with ivy-covered halls, contractors tied to chemical tests with corporate logos, officers who approved nuclear exercises with stars on their shoulders. The same names repeat across decades, shifting roles but never leaving the system, a revolving door of complicity. It becomes clear, this wasn't a series of disconnected errors born of ignorance. It was a doctrine, carried from one program to the next by individuals who knew exactly what they sanctioned, their careers built on the backs of the broken. We confront contemporary officials with these findings, presenting transcripts in sterile offices. Some concede carefully that these were mistakes of the era, products of fear and Cold War urgency, their apologies scripted and shallow. But when pressed on responsibility, on why no one was ever prosecuted, why secrets persist, the answers dissolve into abstractions. Context of the times, limited understanding of risks, different standards of ethics. The past is admitted in whispers, but ownership evaporates, leaving only the hollow echo of institutional regret, a performance for the cameras. For Tom Alvarez, listening to the tape is like hearing the truth he's always known but never had confirmed, a validation that brings no comfort. "They talk about us like we're numbers on a balance sheet," he says, voice unsteady with emotion. "But I remember the faces, my friends, my brothers, lost to illnesses they blamed on bad luck." His memory collides with the cold certainty of the recording, binding lived experience to documented intent, forging a chain that cannot be broken. The weight of the evidence builds to a simple, devastating truth. The object of study was never disease, never resilience, never defense in any noble sense. It was the human being stripped of choice, reduced to a test case. Consent was irrelevant, a formality skipped. Ethics were expendable, overridden by ambition. What mattered was yield, data, thresholds, how far could control extend before rebellion. And every program, every project was designed to find out just how much could be taken from a person before they broke, the answers logged for future use. As the final seconds of the tape fade into static, the silence in our own room deepens, heavy with implication. We are left with a truth that cannot be redacted, a confession spoken plainly. The government turned its own citizens into subjects because they could not say no, preying on the voiceless to advance agendas shrouded in shadows. And from that silence emerges the final step of our story, the reckoning carried not in files or tapes, but in the scars of those who lived through it, etched into the very skin of a nation, a testament that demands to be heard. The final gathering unfolds not in a lab or archive, but in a modest hall filled with voices once silenced, a community center with folding chairs arranged in circles like a support group for the forsaken. Survivors stand together. Tom Alvarez with his military bearing unbroken, Alan from the prison wing with his scarred arms bared as badges, Men and women who grew up in state orphanages now standing tall despite the weight of years. They do not speak as test subjects anymore, reduced to codes. They speak as witnesses, their testimonies weaving a tapestry richer than any document. Their memories, once fragments scattered like ashes, interlace into a collective story, a living document that no file could fully contain, pulsing with emotion and detail. The weight of what happened is no longer hidden in boxes. It breathes here, in their words, in their presence, filling the room with a palpable energy. Tom steps forward, holding a photograph of his unit taken before the atomic blasts, the image creased from years in his wallet. Young faces full of optimism, now ghosts in his narrative. He names the men one by one, some gone to illness that crept slowly like a thief, others still fighting battles within their own bodies, their strength waning. "We were told it was training for a greater cause," he says, his voice steady but laced with sorrow. "But it was an experiment, and we paid with our lives, our future stolen in the name of science." Alan shows the scarred patches on his arm, no longer evidence for a courtroom but testimony for history, running his fingers over the rough texture. "They thought we'd be forgotten in our cells," he mutters, a defiant spark in his eyes. "But here we are, speaking truths they buried." Around them, former orphanage wards recall breakfasts that still haunt their senses, each spoonful now revealed for what it was. A disguised dose that altered destinies, leaving lingering tastes and unexplained ailments. Ellen Carson, the archivist who first pulled the human factor file from its box with trembling hands, listens quietly from the side, her notebook filled with notes that bridge paper to people. She reflects on how easy it is to bury the truth under layers of bureaucracy. Red tape wound like chains, yet how fragile those layers become when survivors refuse silence, their persistence cracking the facade. "The system wanted data, cold and impersonal," she says softly, her words measured like a scholar's. "But what it created was memory, and memory resists erasure, growing stronger with each retelling." Her words frame the truth of the story. The past cannot be undone, but it can be unveiled, brought into light where it demands accountability. The camera drifts back to the archives, where rows of boxes still sit stacked in endless aisles, each one a silent witness to untold chapters. But now the lens lingers on what the boxes never held. Names spoken aloud, faces captured in close-up, the intimate cost behind each stamped directive. Families torn, dreams deferred, lives shortened. For decades, the files defined these people as subjects, anonymous entries. Today, they reclaim their identities as mothers who raised children despite pain, fathers who worked through fatigue, brothers and sisters who supported each other in quiet solidarity. No longer statistics, no longer variables, fully human, resilient in ways the experiments never measured. The narrative turns forward, toward horizons yet to be shaped. Experts call for transparency, full declassification of remaining files, unrestricted access to archives that still hide volumes, compensation that acknowledges the breadth of harm. Not token sums, but restorative justice. Educators insist this history must be taught in classrooms, integrated into curricula so no student learns science or medicine without also learning the weight of ethics, the dangers of unchecked power. Military veterans demand acknowledgement, not footnotes in history books, but memorials and honors in the record of service, recognizing their sacrifices beyond battlefields. The future, they argue, must be written in daylight, not in shadows, with safeguards forged from lessons hard won. Tom closes his story with a reflection that feels less like testimony and more like a warning etched in stone. "If we forget this, bury it again," he says, his voice carrying across the hall with resonant power. "It happens again in new forms with new excuses. If we remember, honor the pain, it becomes harder to repeat. That's the choice we face, not just to know the facts, but to act on them, to build a world where vulnerability is protected, not preyed upon." His words hang in the air, heavy yet resolute, echoing into a silence that feels transformed, no longer empty but full of resolve, a call to arms for empathy. The camera lingers one last time on the phrase stamped across so many pages. Human factor, its blue ink faded but indelible. Once a euphemism for exploitation, a code for cruelty, it now becomes a mirror held up to society. It reflects the truth of a system that chose convenience over conscience, ambition over humanity, and the resilience of those who survived it, emerging stronger from the crucible. As the screen fades to black, the story leaves us not with closure, but with responsibility, a lingering echo that demands response. The scars remain, on skin marked by chemicals, in memory haunted by blasts, across the fabric of the nation woven with threads of injustice. They are the trace that proves history happened, the mark that demands to be seen, acknowledged, healed. And they leave us with one final question, whispered in the darkness. When the next sealed box is opened, revealing shadows we dare not imagine, will we have learned enough to ensure it does not tell the same story again, or will the cycle of silence and suffering repeat?